Clint Eastwood was 3,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean when the engine died. No warning, no sputter, just silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any explosion. The single-engine Navy bomber he was riding in as a passenger suddenly became a 10,000-pound coffin, plummeting toward the black water below. It was September 1951, and the man who would become Hollywood's toughest icon was about to face the most terrifying night of his life. A night that would either kill him or forge him into something unbreakable. Most people don't know this story. They know Clint as the man with no name, as Dirty Harry, as the granite-faced director who never shows weakness. But before all of that, before the fame and the Oscars and the legend, there was a 21-year-old kid from Oakland struggling to survive basic training, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life by joining the military during the Korean War. And on that September night, as freezing Pacific water rushed up to meet him in the darkness, Clint Eastwood learned something that would define the rest of his existence. When death looks you in the eye, you don't look away. You stare back, and you survive. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Clint Eastwood was in 1951. He wasn't a movie star. He wasn't even an actor. He was just a tall, lanky kid who'd been drafted into the Army during the Korean War. Born in San Francisco during the Great Depression, Clint had grown up watching his family struggle. His father, Clinton Sr., moved from job to job, steel mills, gas stations, whatever paid the bills. The family moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough for young Clint to put down roots. That childhood of instability taught Clint something crucial. You can't rely on anything being permanent. You adapt or you suffer. By the time he was a teenager, Clint had developed a kind of emotional armor, a cool detachment that would later become his trademark. But underneath that armor was a kid who desperately wanted to prove himself, to be something more than just another Depression-era casualty. When the draft notice came in 1950, Clint wasn't thrilled, but he wasn't devastated either. The Korean War was raging, and young men across America were being shipped overseas to fight and die in frozen mountains half a world away. Clint reported to Fort Ord in Monterey, California, expecting to be trained and deployed within months. But fate had other plans. During processing, someone noticed that Clint was an excellent swimmer. He'd spent his teenage years working as a lifeguard and swimming instructor at pools in Oakland. The Army needed instructors at Fort Ord's swimming facility. Instead of shipping out to Korea, Clint was assigned to teach soldiers how to swim. It was cushy duty, and Clint knew it. While guys his age were freezing in trenches and dodging bullets, he was spending his days poolside in sunny California. He felt guilty about it sometimes, but not guilty enough to volunteer for combat. He'd do his time, get out, and figure out what came next. The weekends were his escape. Fort Ord was close enough to Los Angeles that Clint could hitchhike down on Friday nights and spend the weekend in the city. There was a girl there, a brunette whose name has been lost to history, but whose smile made the long hitchhike worthwhile. Clint would crash on friends' couches, spend Saturday and Sunday with the girl, then frantically make his way back north to be at formation Monday morning. It was on one of these return trips that Clint's life changed forever. The weekend had been good. The girl had been warm and willing. California's sun had been bright, and for a few days Clint had forgotten about the Army, about Korea, about the uncertainty of his future. But Sunday evening came, as it always did, and reality reasserted itself. He needed to be back at Fort Ord by Monday morning. Missing formation meant disciplinary action, possibly even brig time. Clint stood on the side of the road, thumb out, trying to hitch a ride north. But the traffic was light and nobody was stopping. Hours passed. The sun began to set. Panic crept into Clint's chest. He was going to be late. He was going to get written up, maybe even court-martialed for being AWOL. Then a car pulled over. The driver was a Navy pilot stationed at a nearby naval air base. He listened to Clint's predicament and smiled. "I'm flying a bomber up to Oakland tonight," the pilot said. "Maintenance run. I can drop you near Fort Ord. Be there in less than 2 hours." Clint couldn't believe his luck. What would have been an all-night hitchhike could be done in the time it took to fly up the coast. He climbed into the car, and the pilot drove him to the air station. The aircraft waiting on the tarmac was a Douglas AD Skyraider, a massive single-engine attack bomber that looked like it could survive anything. These planes had fought in World War II and were now being used in Korea. They were workhorses, designed to carry tons of bombs and torpedoes, to take punishment from anti-aircraft fire and keep flying. But they were also maintenance nightmares. The massive radial engine required constant attention. Fuel systems were temperamental. Hydraulics leaked. Pilots joked that the only thing holding a Skyraider together was the paint. Clint didn't know any of this as he climbed into the rear seat. He just knew he was about to get a free ride that would save his ass from military discipline. The pilot ran through the pre-flight checks, fired up the engine, and they taxied to the runway. The takeoff was smooth. The big radial engine roared with power as they climbed into the early evening sky. Below them, the California coast stretched out in both directions, a ribbon of civilization between mountains and ocean. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Clint relaxed in the rear seat. This was incredible. He was flying in a military bomber, watching the sunset from 3,000 feet, and he'd be back at base with time to spare. Everything was working out perfectly. They'd been in the air for maybe 45 minutes when it happened. The engine coughed. Just once. A brief interruption in the steady roar that had filled the cockpit. The pilot's head snapped up, suddenly alert. He checked his instruments, tapped a few gauges. Everything looked normal. The engine settled back into its usual rhythm. Probably just a hiccup in the fuel mixture, the pilot said over the intercom, but Clint could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They flew on. The sun had fully set now, and darkness was spreading across the ocean below them. The coastline was a string of lights to their right, but to their left was nothing but black water stretching to the horizon. They were over the Pacific, miles from shore. The engine coughed again. This time it wasn't hiccup. It was a deep, shuddering seizure that made the entire aircraft vibrate. The pilot swore under his breath and immediately started running through emergency procedures. Toggle switches were flipped. The fuel mixture was adjusted. The throttle was manipulated. Nothing worked. The engine was losing power, the steady roar degrading into an uneven sputter. And then, with a final metallic groan, it died completely. The sudden silence was terrifying. One moment the cockpit had been filled with the comforting thunder of the radial engine. Now there was nothing but the whistle of wind over the wings and the sound of Clint's own breathing, harsh and rapid in his ears. "We've got a problem," the pilot said, and his voice had gone from uncertain to genuinely frightened. "Engine's completely dead. I'm going to try to restart it, but we're losing altitude fast." Clint felt his stomach drop. They were gliding now, a 10,000-pound aircraft with no power, descending toward the Black Pacific at a rate that would have them in the water within minutes. He looked out the canopy. No lights, no land, just darkness and the faint shimmer of moonlight on waves that suddenly looked very solid, very hard, very deadly. The pilot was working frantically, going through the restart checklist. Prime the engine. Hit the starter. Nothing. Try again. Nothing. Check the fuel system. Check the ignition. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The engine was completely dead, and they were running out of altitude fast. "We're going down," the pilot said, and there was no hiding the fear now. His voice was shaking. "We have to ditch in the ocean. When we hit the water, you need to get out immediately. The plane will sink. Do you understand me? Get out fast." Clint's mouth had gone completely dry. His hands were shaking. "I understand," he managed to say. "There are life vests under your seat. Put yours on right now. Make sure it's secure." Clint fumbled beneath his seat in the darkness, his fingers numb with fear and adrenaline. He found the vest, pulled it out, struggled into it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He yanked the straps tight, checked them twice, then looked out at the water rushing up to meet them. They were maybe 500 feet above the ocean now. The pilot was fighting the controls, trying to slow their descent, trying to find the perfect angle for ditching. Too steep, and they'd nosedive and cartwheel, tearing the plane apart. Too shallow, and they'd skip across the surface like a stone, breaking up with each impact. And even if they survived the crash, even if they made out of the sinking aircraft, they'd be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night with no rescue in sight. Clint thought about his mother back in Oakland. He thought about the girl in Los Angeles. He thought about all the things he'd never done, never said, never experienced. He was 21 years old, and he was about to die in the ocean, and his body might never be found. "Brace yourself," the pilot shouted. "We're going in." Clint pressed himself back against the seat, crossed his arms over his chest, tucked his head down, and waited for impact. Time seemed to slow down. Each second stretched into an eternity. He could hear his own heartbeat, fast and loud. He could hear the wind screaming past the canopy. He could hear the pilot muttering what might have been a prayer. And then they hit. The impact was beyond violent. It was cataclysmic. The nose of the Skyraider smashed into the Pacific with tremendous force. The shock wave traveled through the entire aircraft, through Clint's seat, up his spine, snapping his head forward despite his bracing. His vision went white for a second. His ears rang. Every bone in his body felt like it had been rattled loose. Water exploded over the canopy in a massive wave. Metal groaned and buckled. Rivets popped. Somewhere in the fuselage, something snapped with a sound like a gunshot. For one brief, hopeful moment, the plane seemed to be floating. They'd made it. They'd survived the crash. Then the ocean started pouring in. Water came through a dozen cracks and seams, under the canopy rails, through the instrument panel, up through the floor. Ice-cold Pacific water. So cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 frozen knives. The shock of it drove the breath from Clint's lungs. His muscles seized. His brain screamed at him to move, to get out, but his body wouldn't respond. The pilot was already scrambling out of the front cockpit, fighting with the canopy release. "Get out," he screamed. "Get out now. It's sinking." That word, sinking, broke through Clint's paralysis. He looked down and saw water already up to his waist and rising fast. The nose of the plane was tilting down. The tail was lifting up. The Skyraider was beginning its final dive to the ocean floor, and if Clint didn't get out in the next few seconds, he'd be going down with it. He grabbed at his harness release. His fingers were already numb from the cold, clumsy and unresponsive. The buckle wouldn't open. He pulled harder, panic surging through him. The water was up to his chest now. The cockpit was tilting at a steep angle. He could hear air bubbling up from the sinking fuselage, a terrible gurgling sound. He yanked at the buckle with all his strength, and it finally gave. The harness fell away. He was free. He stood up in the flooding cockpit, water now up to his shoulders, and grabbed for the canopy rail. The pilot was already in the ocean, swimming away from the dying aircraft. "Jump!" the pilot screamed. "Jump now before it takes you down." Clint pulled himself up, got one leg over the cockpit rail, then threw himself into the ocean. The cold was indescribable. It was a physical assault. The water was probably around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill in less than an hour. It stole the air from Clint's lungs. His heart felt like it stopped for a second. Every nerve in his body screamed. He kicked hard, swimming away from the plane as fast as his shock muscles would move. Behind him, he could hear the terrible death rattle of the Skyraider, air escaping from a submerging fuselage, metal groaning under pressure. He turned back just in time to see the tail section slip beneath the surface, and then the entire aircraft was gone, swallowed by the black Pacific as if it had never existed. Clint treaded water, gasping, his teeth already chattering violently. The life vest was keeping him afloat, but the cold was relentless. He could feel it seeping into his bones, sapping his strength with every passing second. The pilot swam over to him, his face pale in the moonlight. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the sound of the waves. Clint shook his head, not trusting his voice. He wasn't hurt, not physically, but he was terrified, more frightened than he'd ever been in his life. "We need to stay together," the pilot said. "Don't swim away from me. We need to conserve energy. They'll start searching at first light. We filed a flight plan. They'll know where to look." But even as he said it, Clint could hear the doubt in the pilot's voice. They'd crashed miles from their flight plan route. The plane had turned to avoid clouds, had deviated from course. And even if the searchers knew exactly where to look, the Pacific Ocean was vast beyond comprehension. Two men in life vests were microscopic specks in millions of square miles of water. The odds of being found were slim. The odds of surviving the night were even slimmer. And so they floated. Two men alone in the darkness, bobbing in the swells, trying not to think about what was below them. Thousands of feet of black water and the crushed remains of a sky raider somewhere on the bottom. The cold was the worst part. It was unrelenting, patient, methodical. It crept into Clint's extremities first, his fingers and toes going numb. Then it moved into his limbs, making his muscles cramp and seize. His jaw ached from shivering. His thoughts started to slow down, becoming fuzzy and disconnected. The pilot kept talking, partly to share information, partly to keep both of them awake and alert. We need to keep moving our arms and legs. Don't let yourself go still. That's when hypothermia gets you. And stay awake. You go to sleep out here. You don't wake up. So Clint moved. He flexed his fingers, even though he couldn't feel them. He kicked his legs, even though they felt like lead weights. And he talked. The pilot kept asking him questions, forcing him to respond, to stay engaged. Where are you from? Oakland. You got family there. My mother. My father. Siblings. A sister. Tell me about them. And Clint talked. He talked about growing up poor during the Depression, about his father moving from job to job, trying to keep food on the table, about swimming in the public pools because it was free and got him out of their cramped apartment, about working as a lifeguard, about the girl in Los Angeles, about anything and everything just to keep his mind working and his eyes open. An hour passed. Then two. The cold had moved into Clint's core now. He couldn't stop shivering. His thoughts were becoming increasingly disjointed. He'd start to answer a question and forget what he was saying halfway through. The pilot had to keep shouting at him, slapping his shoulder, forcing him to stay alert. "Don't you dare quit on me," the pilot yelled. "We're going to make it through this. You hear me? We're going to survive." But Clint wasn't so sure. His body was shutting down. The cold was winning. He kept thinking how easy it would be to just close his eyes, to let the life vest hold him up while he slept. Just for a minute. Just to rest. "Eastwood," the pilot screamed, right in his face. "Stay with me. Think about your mother. Think about that girl. You want them to get a telegram saying you drowned? You want that?" No, he didn't want that. Clint forced his eyes open, forced himself to keep moving. But it was getting harder. Every minute was harder than the last. 3 hours. 4. The moon tracked across the sky above them. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. And still they floated, two tiny specks in an ocean that didn't care whether they lived or died. Around the 5-hour mark, Clint started hallucinating. He thought he saw lights in the distance. He thought he heard his mother calling his name. The pilot had to keep bringing him back to reality, reminding him where he was, what was happening. "There's nothing there, Clint. Just stay with me. Focus on my voice." But it was getting harder for the pilot, too. His voice was getting weaker. He'd stopped talking for longer and longer periods. They were both fading, both losing the battle against the cold and the darkness. As dawn began to break over the Pacific, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, Clint was barely conscious. His body had gone past shivering into a kind of rigid stillness that he knew, somewhere in the fog of his mind, was a very bad sign. The pilot had gone quiet, his head lolling forward, only the life vest keeping him afloat. They'd been in the water for more than 6 hours. They weren't going to last much longer. And then, like a miracle, Clint heard it, a sound that cut through the fog in his brain, that made his heart suddenly beat faster. The drone of an aircraft engine. He tried to lift his head, but didn't have the strength. He tried to shout, but his voice was a weak croak. The pilot heard it too. Somehow, from somewhere, he found the energy to reach into his vest and pull out an emergency flare. With hands that shook violently, he pulled the ignition cord. The flare shot into the early morning sky, a brilliant red streak against the pastel dawn. Please, Clint thought. Please see us. Please. The aircraft, a search plane from the Coast Guard, banked hard. It had seen the flare. It was turning toward them. Within minutes, it was circling overhead, and the pilot was radioing their position to rescue ships in the area. 45 minutes later, a Coast Guard cutter arrived. Strong hands reached down into the water, grabbed Clint under his arms, and hauled him up onto the deck. He couldn't stand. His legs wouldn't support him. They wrapped him in blankets, dozens of blankets, but he couldn't stop shaking. Hot coffee was pressed into his hands. He couldn't hold the cup. Someone had to hold it for him while he sipped. The liquid burned going down, but it was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. The pilot was brought aboard a few minutes later. They laid side by side on the deck, wrapped in blankets, alive. Against all odds, impossibly, they'd survived. Clint spent 2 days in the Naval Hospital being treated for severe hypothermia and exposure. His core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. Another hour in the water, and he would have died. The doctors told him he was lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. But Clint didn't feel lucky. He felt changed. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the same face, but something behind the eyes was different. Harder, more focused. He'd looked death in the eye for 6 hours. He'd felt his body shutting down, felt the cold trying to kill him, and he'd refused to quit. He'd survived. When he was discharged from the hospital, he went back to Fort Ord, back to teaching soldiers how to swim, back to the routine of military life. But he was different now. Everyone noticed it. There was a quiet intensity about him that hadn't been there before. A sense that Clint Eastwood had seen something the rest of them hadn't, and it had fundamentally changed him. He never talked about the crash. When people asked, he'd shrug it off. Got wet. Dried out. End of story. That would become classic Clint, minimizing the drama, refusing to play the victim or the hero, just stating facts and moving on. But inside, where it counted, the crash had taught Clint something profound. Life is fragile and uncertain, and the only thing you can control is how you respond when everything goes wrong. You can panic, or you can stay calm. You can give up, or you can fight. And the choice you make in that moment defines who you are. Years later, after his discharge from the Army, Clint drifted to Los Angeles. He had no clear plan, just a vague idea that maybe he could make in the movies. He was tall, good-looking, and had a certain presence. Why not try? But Hollywood wasn't interested. Clint spent years struggling, taking bit parts, getting rejected at auditions, working odd jobs to pay rent. Studio executives told him he was too tall, too stiff. His Adam's apple was too prominent. His voice was too quiet. He should give up and do something else. But Clint didn't give up, because he'd already survived the unsurvivable. Rejection by some studio executive wasn't going to kill him. Poverty wasn't going to kill him. Uncertainty wasn't going to kill him. The Pacific Ocean had tried to kill him and failed. Everything else was just noise. In 1964, a struggling Italian director named Sergio Leone offered Clint a role in a low-budget western being shot in Spain, a fistful of dollars. The pay was terrible. The script was weird. The director barely spoke English. Every reasonable person told Clint to pass. But Clint took the risk. Because if you've already bet your life on a 50-50 chance in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, betting your career on an Italian western doesn't seem so scary. The film made Clint an international star. It launched one of the most iconic careers in Hollywood history. And it all traced back to a decision made by a man who'd already looked death in the eye and learned not to blink. Throughout his career, Clint played characters who faced impossible odds with quiet determination. The Man with No Name, Dirty Harry, William Money, Walt Kowalski. Men who didn't panic, didn't quit, didn't back down. Critics called it good acting, but people who knew Clint's story understood. He wasn't acting. He was just being himself. That night in the Pacific Ocean in September 1951, a scared kid went into the water. But the man who climbed out 6 hours later was forged in ice and darkness and sheer willpower. That man would go on to define American masculinity for generations. But all started with one simple choice. When death comes calling, you can surrender or you can fight. Clint Eastwood fought, and he won, and he's been winning ever since. Still making films at 94, still telling stories, still refusing to quit. Because once you've stared into the abyss for 6 hours and climbed back out, Everything else is just details. The Douglas AD Skyraider that crashed that night was never recovered. It lies somewhere on the ocean floor off the California coast. A tomb that almost was. But Clint Eastwood didn't stay in that tomb. He clawed his way out of the darkness and built a legend. And the next time you watch a Clint Eastwood film, the next time you see that famous squint, that unshakable calm in the face of danger, remember, that's not movie magic. That's what it looks like when a man has already survived the unsurvivable and knows that whatever comes next can't be worse than 6 hours in the freezing Pacific, waiting to die but refusing to quit. That's the real Clint Eastwood story. A man, the ocean, and the choice to survive.